anem a començar. La sessió d'avui serà en anglès. Jo començaré en català perquè hi ha tants amics a la sala que m'agradaria agrair-los al màxim la seva presència i la seva confiança en aquest projecte. Seguirem en anglès, primer en honor dels invitats i també del màster en arquitectura avançada que es fa en anglès i que és l'idioma de tots els estudiants que estan avui amb nosaltres. Well, evidently, welcome and thank you for your presence today here. And evidently, your interest in our project and transversal activities. I introduce myself, evidently. I am Manuel Gausa. I am the new dean of the IAC, of this center. And for us, it's a very, very important day today. It's the open lecture of our program. And I want to introduce some concepts, and after, evidently, to introduce our hosts, especially John Palmesino and Hernandez Alonso. Thanks for your presence here and for this strange duet or dialogue in between you. And evidently, Areti Markopoulou, who is the director of the Master in Advanced Architecture and director of programs here in the IAC. Well, when we found this center in 2001, 10 years ago, we were absolutely convinced that we were assisting a change of thought, of thinking in our knowledge, in our societies, in our cultures, and evidently in the spatial translation. So, in the architecture, in the city, and in a new kind of relational landscapes. This change was linked evidently with the new digital tools and with a more complex perception of our realities. But above all, it was linked with the evidence of more complex, dynamic, multiplied conditions of our environments. The city, evidently, as the first manifestation of this change, but ourselves also as a society, more polyhedrical and relational entities. I think that the big conquest of these transformations was the capacity to exchange. I think this capacity to cross, to exchange, to process, and to orientate with criteria informations, data, situations, conditions, contexts, spaces, and natures in a new kind of informational environment has been the big conquest of the change of knowledge. This evidence of a more dynamic, complex, and transversal capacity of interaction. Capacity of interaction. Interaction in the sense of exchange of informations, interchange of informations. This capacity of interaction has been the big revolution of this new era. And we are together exploring this new knowledge, together here and with a lot of you. I'm talking indeed of exploration, so of research. This is a center of research. Evidently, it's a center of education, it's a center of production, it's a center of diffusion of the ideas, but above all, it's a center of research. We were always convinced, in this sense, of the enormous urban and architectural background and the potential of Barcelona as a talent and leadership context. And at the same time, we were convinced of the emergency of a new generation of architects, geographers, designers, computer conceptors, artists, scientists, thinkers, etc., who want to share this global and local intellectual and operational adventure, to understand and to develop together with doubts, with risks, with tests, with trials, with challenges, a new collective and transdisciplinary thinking linked with a new advanced logic. We talk of advanced architecture, we talk of advanced logic. It's a logic that beyond the classical, the modern, and the postmodern paradigms is trying to build today this new kind of social and spatial organizations and habitat linked with the informational interactions. We are very happy to share together the challenge with you, and we want to celebrate with you this plural condition of the research. I was talking with the students, no? Research is a fantastic word. Research as recherche, as recerca, no? Ricerca, cercare, the idea to look for, búsqueda, exploración, etc. No? But research also as investigación, investigation, investigación, to invest and to invert, to look for, but to look beyond topics, beyond standards, beyond conventions. Research, in fact, as recognition, and research as creation, as a prospective activity. This center was born as a center of excellence. It's a center of excellence here in Barcelona, it's very clear, but its vocation is not to be a too institutional, too academical, too regulate space, but a creative environment for the risk, for the exploration, for the experimentation, for the imagination, and the conviction and the passion combined with a new social and cultural implication. A laboratory of things and things more than an institutional academy. We can be satisfied, I think that we can be satisfied of the level of the achievement obtained by the anterior directors and founders of this project, and evidently with this actually motor staff, or no sé cómo llamarlo, inductor staff, that believes in this project. Evidently, Areti Markopoulou, as director of the AMA, Thomas Diaz, director of the Fab Lab, Nuria Diaz, director of the Baidaura project, Xavi González, director of the Master in Interaction, Rodrigo, Rubio, Ana Salvador, Silvia, Brandy, Luis Fraguada, and a lot of people who collaborate with us. We have a Master in Advanced Architecture, evidently. I think it's one of the most innovative and cosmopolitan postgraduate and multi-scholar programs in the world. We have a Master in Interaction that is a new and pioneer program oriented to explore the new interfaces, devices between information, people, and spaces. We have a Fab Lab that is a technological and also conceptual laboratory of digital and material productions and networks. We have the Baidaura project, that it's an absolutely crucial program of research combining the informational knowledge with a natural, ecological, and human sensibility. We are trying to increase this multiple exploration of these new informational and interactive conditions of our knowledge, conditions of interaction with urban and territorial, architectural and contextual, technological and industrial, sensorial and cultural, social and environmental implications. Interactions that are specific in our programs and are transversal at the same time. But now we have new challenges. We want to open a new PhD program, a university master program in advanced architecture and knowledge. We want also to open an observatory and a laboratory about Barcelona and its urban and territorial transformations in relation with the new conditions of the city. We want also to increase the research in smart and wise cities, combining it with the research in a more intelligent and empathic urbanism. We want also to open a new international platform of hostings to cross research and experiences with different centers and units here and in the world. We want indeed to reinforce the double and vocational nature of the IAC, to be a creative laboratory of production and to be also a transfer, a meeting point of creative and intellectual exchange and diffusion of this more advanced and why not creative, conscientious, I don't know in English, conscientious, sensitive ideas for a new, and we hope, more generous, progressist, and convivial environments. Thank you, and thank you for your presence. And now I give the floor to Areti Markopoulou, who introduced John Palmesino and Hernan Diazco. Thank you. Thank you, Areti.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Manuel. Thank you for being here today with us. It's a very special day today, mainly because we are welcoming more than 100 students, that they are coming from over 38 different countries around the world. And we think that we're certain that the IAC Academy is more ambitious than ever. Not only we consolidate our Masters in Advanced Architecture of 1 and 2 years, but we are also launching a new Masters in Advanced Interaction. So we want to welcome all new people and all new students. It's also an important day since for the first time after 7 years, we are doing this inauguration ceremony together with Manuel Gausa, that was the co-founder of IAC back in 2001, when together with other visionary architects such as Vicente Guayart and Willy Muller, they tried to set up an IAC not as a traditional academic center, as Manuel said, but rather as a platform of dialogue, a platform of interchange, and mainly a platform of research and innovation. And of course, we are very glad and we are very honored to share this ceremony together with important friends and important architects and urbanists, such as, for example, John Palmesino, that is a very special friend of IAC. Last year, together with him and Willy Muller, we have prepared a publication out of a very informal interview of a 2-hour eating and thinking and brainstorming. And we're very happy that we have you today with us. And allow me to read a bit about John Palmesino's bio. As I said, he's an architect and urbanist. Born in Switzerland, he has led the researches at ETH Studio Basel Contemporary City Institute between 2003 and 2007. He has co-founded Multiplicity, which is an international research network involved in contemporary architecture, urbanism, arts, and general culture. Main works of him include Mutation, Uncertain States of Europe, and Solid Sea. Multiplicity's works have been exhibited at the Venice Biennale, at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, at the KW Berlin, at the Triennale di Milano, and at Documenta 11. And last, he's a professor in the Research Architecture Center, Goldsmiths, University of London, where he also is the initiator of the interdisciplinary research on neutrality as a modality of spatial transformation and control. This you will need to explain it. Before passing the word to John, I would also say that we're glad to have today with us as well Hernan Diaz Alonso, who together with John will participate on a debate, hopefully, on present and future cities, sustainable territorial strategies, as well as technology and advanced computation as tools for the future urban strategies. And allow me to read a bit about Hernan as well, that he's the principal and founder of Zephyro Arts, a Los Angeles-based design practice. He's considered one of the most influential voices of his generation, and he assumed the new role of graduate program chair at SCI-Arc after having coordinating the school's graduate thesis project for the past several years. He's also a visiting professor at Yale University and has been teaching at Columbia University and Universität für angewandte Kunst in Vienna, Austria. Diaz Alonso architecture designs and work have received numerous awards, such as the first prize of PS1 MoMA's Young Architects Program competition, and his work has been exhibited at the San Francisco MoMA, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Max Center, Vienna, and the EFRAG Center. And with that, I would like to both thank John and Hernan, and please help me welcome John and start his lecture. Thank you very much.
I also come from a small institution, a small institution that prides itself for being independent, the Architectural Association in London. And so I share a lot of the efforts to establish a platform for discussion of what architecture can be, how it can operate, and how it can imagine how it become in the future. And most of these discussions and preoccupations happen as usual in architecture, in a room. The amazing thing of operating in small institutions is that you basically put people together in a room, and interesting discussions about the future of architecture might come up. What I would like to do this evening is to share with you some elements of thinking and research around the notion of infrastructure that I've been working on and testing in the work that I conduct with territorial agency, both in London and in other parts of the urbanized world. As soon as this machine comes up, we'll see how I intend to structure this discussion that would eventually lead with a dialogue with Hernan. The idea is quite simple: to put out some markers, maybe 5 or 6 markers of how architecture today is operating as a border. Manuel said as a crossing. What happens when you start crossing a border? And architecture, I would posit, is a technology of the border, a technology that structures a very complex system of trespassing, enclosing, separating, modulating different initiatives. When you cross the border, you become a monster. And that is what I will try to argue this evening, that the difficulty in thinking architecture today has to do with what a friend of mine, Anselm Franke, would call the monster of modernity. The monster of modernity is not just the other, is not just the deformed, is not just the impossible to reconcile with rationality. It is, on the contrary, the very heart of this technology of the border that architecture is. So, when we think of architecture as a border, as a condition that is not one of buildings, but it's a technology that links buildings to people, to inhabitation, to different way of coexistence, we start seeing the question of intervention in slightly different terms. Today, the majority of our preoccupation in architecture is somehow related to one specific monster, and that is the monster of fascination, the monster of putting out into the world something that will enchant us and will make us subjugated to the operations. As I said, I would like to structure my talk as a series of jottings, as a series of sketches of elements of research and thinking that I've been testing in the recent work with territorial agency. The title of the talk is not so scary as it looks in these graphics, but it's an attempt that I would like to discuss with you. It's a proposition that I would like to put more than to Hernan, to the students that are starting today the masters. And that is that probably today, to think of architecture, to think of the architectural project, that is that which sets out into the future and anticipates the things to come, we have to rethink notions of infrastructure. And we have to think of notions of infrastructure sideways. Not being able to reveal infrastructure, but as in the unconscious, operating through minimum actions that might reveal the other. And that revealing of the other, as I mentioned, is linked, in my opinion, to the primordial acts of architecture. So what I will argue for is that we are at the same time in a situation where we no longer can think of architecture as the master of the arts, as the central condition that operates large consensual transformations of the city, and at the same time we have to reimagine architecture, because today architecture is more and more urgent. So we are in a situation of being marginal, of being irrelevant, and urgent at the same time. The idea that architecture is an operation which is a monster. It's a monstrous operation. It is about crossing. It is about defining lines, separations, inclusion. Is what I would call the primordial act of construction. The moment that we establish a difference, let's say to protect a garden from the outer world, we are not only putting up a wall to promote life, we are separating, we are excluding, we are distinguishing things. And that primordial action is what I consider the technology of architecture. It's a technology of relations, primarily linked to notions of the border. So this evening I would like to take you through certain elements of border crossings, of border establishment. I will not try to show you this in a demonstrating way. Again, the word monster, demonstrate, comes up. But on the contrary, I will just try to mark the terrain in order to maybe have a discussion about what it means today to think border technologies. I would start exactly 404 years ago, in 1608. In 1608, a young man, more or less the same age as the students, named Hugo Grotius, was asked by the first corporation, by the first capitalist corporation in the world, to come up with a defense against a case that was brought by the Empire of Spain. Spain was, at that time, the major power in the world, and off the coast of Sumatra, they conquered a fantastic prize. They got a ship, and it contained so much gold, so much so many amazing jewels and stones that they would basically cover the costs of running the entire campaigns in the Americas. Hugo Grotius was called by the Dutch East India Company to defend their case because in a shipwreck off the coast of Sumatra, the Dutch seized the prize away from the Spanish. And Hugo Grotius came up with this defense against the impossibility of the Dutch to keep the prize. The Spanish wanted the money back. And Hugo Grotius, which is considered the founder of international law, invented this very simple idea that people have the right to visit other people. Somehow, an idea of hospitality. If we have the right to visit any other people, we should be able to travel to visit the other people. Hence, the sea should be free. And in order for the sea to be free, to be devoid of any obstruction, of any borders, we have to define the sea. We have to set clearly demarcations where you are allowed to be free and where you're not allowed to be free. And somehow, in an inversion of logic, Hugo Grotius transforms the liquid waters of the sea into land. The notion of territorial waters, the spaces upon which you can identify a possibility of control, demarcated by the range of the cannonballs, is invented together with the notion of the freedom of the seas. Of course, a corollary aspect of this is that the freedom of visiting other peoples is a natural law. Hence, there's an idea of nature as empty, together as being considered free. Grotius imagines the seas as empty, the empty ocean, which, of course, is the basis for harsh colonization. Another moment, another marker of this complex condition of thinking technologies of the borders is 1941. Again, at sea, this time off the coast of Nova Scotia. At the height of the Second World War, two groups of ships meet. One is carrying the Prime Minister of His Majesty's government, Winston Churchill, on HMS the Prince of Wales. And the other ship, the USS McDonnell, is carrying President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The two ships meet in order to discuss possible joining, possible reaching out, a possibility of trespassing borders and uniting in the fight against the Nazi terror. What comes out of that meeting is an idea of bonding institutions, of bonding the different nations, the United Nations, as in the Atlantic Charter. The idea of Grotius was an idea that somehow contained and territorialized notions of authority in large territorial entities with freedom of passage and movement across the oceans. The notion here is one of diminishing sovereignty, of containing in another way, of modulating the sovereignty of the Nazi and the National Socialist and the fascist regimes that are at that time creating so much terror both in Asia and in Europe. The United Nations at the beginning are an idea of the Allies. The United Nations coincide with the Allies. 1945, after the war, the United Nations becomes a large organization that again starts in its concepts to think itself as stepping out of the frameworks of nation states. I would argue that it's a major architecture. It's probably the biggest architectural project of the 20th century. The amazing logo, by the way, is designed by an architect, the same architect who designed the courtroom of the Nuremberg trial. His name is MacDonald, and he was the main architect of the CIA. The relationship between that zenithal projection of the UN logo and the zenithal projection of that is at the basis of the NATO charts of navigation maybe highlights the difficulty of thinking the UN as simply a condition of trespassing national borders, of undoing national borders and enlarging national borders, so somehow augmenting national borders, but somehow elicits the difficult conditions of the Cold War at the very heart of the UN organization. Somehow we could start thinking that if architecture is operating as a border technology, as a border between data, knowledge, and physical structures, we could start thinking that architecture is a relational mode. It's not a building, it's a relation between material conditions, material processes, material structures, erosion, construction, decay, and what I would argue is the most important word that we got from the Greeks, the politeia, the polis, or I prefer the politeia because it somehow brings with it the notion of constituted and constitutive power. The Greek had this beautiful word, the politeia, which was translated back from the Latins into republic, the public thing. And through that, we lost somehow the difficulty in thinking the thing, in thinking the possibilities of gathering around the very stones of the city. And we ended up thinking of representational modes of the contemporary powers. So architecture as a technology that relates polities, like small institutions, like the IAC is a small polity, like nations, like cities, like regions, like United Nations, international organizations, non-governmental organization, individual enterprises, families, or corporations, like the East Dutch India Company. The idea of thinking architecture as a polity and as a space in relation brings us probably to one of my favorite architects. I don't think that many of the architectural historians will recognize Thomas Hobbes as one of the great architects of the modern time. Hobbes had a very simple idea, that we operate in a body politic, that we are to give up our individual rights to a body that is larger, that is somehow incorporating, like in a vast reorganization, like in a vast architecture, the public elements of life. And somehow we have to think of the construction of that body politic as a purely rational construction, as a purely organized and carefully balanced construction of rights and authorities. Somehow the idea of the body politic brings about the distinction, again a separation, again a distinction, a demarcation, which is the idea that the body politic separates the sovereign from civic society. The notion of civic society, of civic enthusiasm, I would say, is coinciding with the work of this great thinker, politician, architect. Someone who rethought the connections of that border technology between how you organize the land, how do you organize the material spaces, and how you organize the spaces of the mind. A less frightening person is probably Elinor Ostrom, a great thinker that just passed away last summer. Elinor Ostrom was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize for economy. And she had a very simple idea. She had an idea that if we are dealing with a limited world, limited resources, we cannot only have one way of knowing it. And the usual way of knowing that world is that straight line. So you see it in this graph. Sorry for the typo, enterprises with an S, not with a C. But the graph indicates two curves. The rectilinear one is cost-benefits analysis. You have a certain cost and you get certain benefits. The curve is the maximum yield from limited resources. So what you see is that you start in time getting more and more extraction, and you reach the peak, and then you constantly reach out and dig more out of your resources, but in the meantime they're depleting. The interesting thing of the work of Elinor Ostrom is that she thinks that the body politic is no longer just one organization, is no longer just one thinking of that relation, as in the economic condition, where somehow you end up discovering that you are already in a non-resilient, in a non-sustainable condition when it's too late, but it's on the contrary a complex condition of separating many different ways of knowing, many ways of engaging with institutions, having different decision-making processes coexist at the same time. Again, here we see that the possibility of thinking what an intervention is, what a project is, and you will have to do many of those during your stay here at the IARC, and most of them, I understand, will be thought as direct interventions into the city of Barcelona, into the regional area of Barcelona. What does it mean to think of those actions as a reconnection of that situation of the border technology? So, of course, in order to act, we are always thinking that we need to know more. We need to know more in order to act better. So we need to survey, we need to measure, we need to control, We need to modulate the different phenomena that are somehow under scrutiny, and we need to contain. We need to separate. And this is what I would argue is the rise of the infrastructural unconscious. The possibility of constantly reverting to technologies of containment, of separation, of setting and abiding by borders, both in the mind, like expert knowledges, and in space, and in processes, and in flows, is what characterizes the difficulty in thinking of intervention in architecture today. To measure, to look at things, to inspect. This is, of course, a beautiful painting, Rembrandt. And in this notion of researching, or like the American says, researching, looking again, with the emphasis on the re, we start seeing in this image a possibility which is peculiar, which is somehow, again, the notion of the monster. Not because of the alterity of the image that we're looking at, but somehow because those doctors that are assembled, like in a new architecture, around a dead body, are not looking at the body. Somehow they are looking all in that book that is in the right corner, in the lower part of the image. The possibility of thinking that analysis is never frontal. Somehow the analysis always operates sideways through indication of what is not directly there. So you have to look not at the open arm of the dead body, but you have to look at the anatomical atlas in order to understand what you're seeing. It's like when you draw. When you try to make a portrait of a person, or when you're trying to sketch a building, you don't look at the building, and you don't even look at the drawing. You have to constantly move your gaze away. And I would try to argue that that possibility of looking is today being augmented by remote sensing technologies, by digital ways of gathering data, by possibilities of rethinking the very means of observation, by rethinking how we look at things in order not to know more, but somehow in order to see again, to look again, to research. These are tracts of sensing, of ships sensing the oceans. Again, I have idiosyncrasy with the seas. You see on the left the Scandinavian peninsula and seen from the north. What happens is that the moment that when we start measuring the surface of the planet, the moment when we start measuring the possibilities of inhabitation of this planet, we somehow start relying on expert knowledge, on that very knowledge that is at the heart of the modern monster, separation. You become an architect, an urbanist, an engineer, and so on. Today, that separation is probably the most powerful set of separations and technologies that we are facing. It's probably the most powerful border technologies that we are experiencing in our daily life. This is a very slow motion image. It takes around 3 minutes to move. And it's a remote sensing data from a satellite that flies or orbits at 705 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. And in this one in particular is a satellite that detects movement of ships. And is a European satellite that is there to alert when a ship is not navigating with a transponder, so you don't know what they're doing. Maybe they're trafficking people, maybe they're trafficking arms, maybe they're trafficking unwanted conditions. And the interesting thing of this remote sensing image is that the moment that they detect something unwanted, from that moment until they can readjust the measuring technology, it passes something like 3.5 minutes. And in those 3.5 minutes, you already lost track of what you were looking for. Somehow, it is there to demonstrate, I put that image there to demonstrate that to know more doesn't really mean to look more carefully. Sometimes we think that we have access to new technology, hence we will know more. In that situation, you just have a glimpse. And then the satellite moves on its trajectory, in order to reach another moment. And of course, that passage is sometimes a passage that misses a trajectory of desperate people that try to cross the sea, to reach through, to cross another border. The border, for instance, that is reorganized in the spaces of the Mediterranean. This is an image of an ID card of a young engineer who wanted to come to Europe to make a master's. And his name was Ampalagan Ganeshu. He was from Sri Lanka. He somehow disappeared on the night of Christmas, 1996. And nothing of his ship, nothing of his friends was found for many, many years, in spite of the fact that everyone in Sicily, where that shipwreck occurred, knew about the fact that 256 people died on Christmas night, 1996. Somehow, there was a situation that was kept in motion and kept going, where everybody knows the fact that in our very sea, in the Mediterranean, the cradle of civilization, crossing the border today means most of the time to die. That particular condition is not simply a denial, is not simply a blockage, it's not simply a condition of separating things. It's a particular condition of border operations of contemporary architecture, where the possibility of controlling, of measuring, of separating flows is changing vast spaces into spaces where trajectories never meet, where intensification of flows brings them to be parallel. And when they do meet, they collide, they crash. The image that you see is enchanting. It's a very slow, enchanting image, and it's a submarine camera that we sent down in 2001 with the help of the journal, the newspaper La Repubblica, to investigate the shipwreck, whether we could find proof of that, or evidence, something that we could demonstrate the incredible shipwreck in the Mediterranean. Of course, all you see is dust, the mud at the bottom of the sea, somehow depicting a very strange space, which is the new space of the Mediterranean, a space divided, is what we called at that time the solid sea. I would like now to make another step, another element of thinking borders and trying to think what it means to intervene. And I would like to, this time, to bring you through a number of documents which is far larger than the few images that I've been showing you. There are two sets of documents that stem from two different archives. The first archive is the archives of the Republic of China. Not the People's Republic of China, but the Republic of China, which is now based in the island of Formosa, or Taiwan. And it's a series of archives that try to indicate the rise of a number of technologies to delimit the land, to separate the people, and to control the movement of people. This set of archives starts early on with ideas of inhabitation, with ideas of building cities, connecting them with railways, making them efficient. And this is particularly interesting because it's a Japanese map that shows the infrastructural basis of Taiwan, or somehow show things like this. The stamp that allows the Republic of China in 1999 to access the World Trade Organization. Somehow, again, controlling movements, controlling flows, controlling different trajectories. Or like this one, a document that shows how to move property of land. The moment that the Japanese were kicked out at the end of the Second World War after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the entire population had to be replaced completely, and the Chinese came in and the Japanese had to go out. How do you register land transactions? Or documents like this one that try to depict the interventions of the US Army in order to stop the Japanese counterinsurgency. Or documents like this, and I can go on almost ad infinitum. The Republic of China has national archives that are basically a collection of documents of infrastructure. This is an image that shows the possibility of controlling and measuring atmosphere, the typhoons, or controlling and measuring subjectivities, Miss Taiwan, 1955, or the Sino-American relationship, or the separations of the compounds of the national army, or the documents that somehow put in place the possibility of accelerating data acquisition and the presence of IBM in Taiwan, or the documents that show how to register land formation and the difficult conditions of that volcanic island, or documents that show how to somehow organize food and separate food, or invent new food, the triploid seedless watermelon. The Ministry of Economic Affairs to establish China Steel, the ways to join the World Trade Organization, new act to develop local business areas, the Ministry of Economic Affairs order, ITRI to shift to semiconductor research. Semiconductor research means basically possibility of building these things. Allowing PPP, public-private partnerships, to build new power plants that eventually end up being the very power plants that leak into their waste into the waters, or the self-salvation of the Formosan people. Somehow, we started collecting recently all these documents and categorizing the different modes of operation of technologies of separation, technologies of border, technologies of containment. And we, inspired by the talks here with Willi and with Areti about the 5 cycles, somehow the 5 technologies to the cycle of water, what happens when you start measuring how to intervene in that cycle, how to collect water, how to detect the impurity of water, how to allow water distribution, the cycle of movement of people. How do you contain people? How do you separate people? How do you relocate people? How do you reorganize people's ideas and so on? Suddenly you enter into the 3rd cycle, so water, people movement, and idea containment, the notion of information technology. How do you think of information technology as a very complex system of organizing the relationship between polities and spaces, as an architecture of power, of separation, almost in a Foucauldian way? Or how do you start looking at the food cycle, and you start entering conditions where you start seeing fertilizers being promoted, or you start seeing the possibility of measuring not only land ownership, but the how can I say, the impossibility of moving because of land ownership. So if you are a farmer, you have to stay a farmer, otherwise you are no longer contained by the technology of the state. Or in this other condition, the cycle of money. What happens when you establish yourself as an independent or quasi-nation at the outset of Second World War? Inflation. So suddenly you start seeing all the bonds that are put into the system. The other set of connections of documents that this archive contains is a vast set of images that somehow try to relate that particular island that we might think of being completely detached from the world to larger organizations. And this in particular is fascinating because it shows, it's got nothing to do with geopolitics, don't worry. It shows the organization of the Asian supercomplex, which is a vast area where the quantities that we can measure in drinking water of arsenic are detected to be fatal. The arsenic is a natural element. It's one of the elements of the periodic table. It is part of our bodies, but if we ingest too much arsenic in our drinking water, we end up with a very monstrous disease. And the Taiwanese have been drinking for decades water that contained 0.9 milligrams of arsenic per liter. And the World Health Organization only put in place measurement techniques that would measure 5 milligrams per liter. So from 0.9 to 5, you see what can happen. The Blackfoot disease, you get completely deformed. So you start seeing that the possibilities of measuring are affecting directly life. The second element of archiving that we want to, that I would like to share with you tonight is an archiving of a photographer, Armin Linke, a great friend who gave me access to his entire archive. Somehow Armin is on a mission to document everything that is changing on the surface of the planet in the last 30 years. So suddenly you start seeing this fantastic condition where everything that we can think of, every aspiration, every dream, every possibility of thinking alternative futures is transformed into protocols, is transformed into guidelines, into infrastructures to contain, to separate movement, to guide water, to rethink how we produce energy, and so on. Immediately we start seeing that, and this is what I would like to pose to you as a question, that the very possibility of intervention that technology gives us refrains us from aspirations. Immediately we turn into these side conditions of engaging with procedures, with mechanisms of calculation that are at the heart of that notion of the body politic, remember. This is, of course, the atomic plants, Hong Kong, and so on. Suddenly you start seeing that the infrastructural unconscious is no longer to be considered just as the unseen elements of governance or governmentality, but as us becoming somehow unaware, unconscious to our own environment. Somehow our own environment is becoming us. We are becoming a mixture with the environment. Our dreams become that. What we want is becoming infrastructure. The market in Amsterdam, the new bridge over the metropolitan region of Copenhagen, Malmö, and so on, the Three Gorge Dam. Every time that we put in place an aspiration, it becomes an infrastructure, somehow a tool that we hope will enable us. And somehow we become enabled by it. We become it. And this is the element of the infrastructural unconscious that I think is most problematic in thinking architecture today, because obviously architecture, you say, is not that. That is something that engineers do, something that other people do. But you start seeing that that separation is exactly the problem, that separation in the construction process of our territories, in the architecture of our territories, is what keeps us at bay in thinking how we can act. Are we just one of the many practices? How are we negotiating our position with those practices? And if we are negotiating, are we diminishing things? Are we watering out the very foundations of our practice? Or are we giving up certain assumptions and entering innovative processes? How do we think through infrastructure? How can we start rethinking our notions of projects vis-a-vis these conditions? A last infrastructural element, a last marker, again linked to an archive. Possibility of marking no longer just flows, movements, cycles, and guiding them and containing them, but trying to detect change, trying to not just to look at how we can contain, but how change appears. So how can we think of the new? How can we imagine the new no longer in that monstrous condition where the new has to be radically different from the past, the modern? You know? Somehow we can only think of modernity as an anticipation of what is yet to come, the impossibility of thinking of continuity. So bear in mind this spectrum for some minutes. So in red, 1987, the end of the martial law in Taiwan. This is a project that is heavily based on Taiwan. In green, 1997, the year when after Hong Kong was given up, or also the moment when Taiwan enters the World Trade Organization. And 2009, between 2009 and 2012, the establishment of cross-strait cooperations between Taiwan, between the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China. So 1997, and you heard that story in the last weeks about the contested islands, that maybe there would be a war, and it's about those three little islands there. So red, green, blue, RGB, the spectrum of the visible is detected in the archives of the Landsat Earth Observation Program. 3 samples, 3 cross-sections in the archive detect the changes in the hard surfaces of the planet. I don't know if we can see it. There's a lamp pushing at it. Anyway. In this image, you see in blue the Pearl River Delta, which is infamous in architecture because of a big, thick red book called The Great Leap Forward by Rem Koolhaas. In blue, you see everything that was not there in 2000, but is there today. So basically, you start seeing in blue everything that has been built in the hard surfaces, every transformation in the hard surfaces that have occurred in the last 10 years. In 2011, we start detecting the vast expansion of the Chinese cities. You start seeing how the cities are exploding, somehow uncontained, stepping out, crossing their margin. In 1999, 10 years before, we start seeing smaller areas, like the ones around the island of Formosa that you can see in that area. 2011, back again, we start seeing in Taiwan the containment of the rivers, the reorganization of the flood areas in those variation of colors. Red, green, blue. What is red is what is there at the outset of the 90s. What is green is what is there in 2000. What is blue only in 2010. And the variations are in between. Suddenly we start seeing a territory that is not only undergoing a vast reorganization through separation, demarcation, and modulation of intensities, but it's also somehow at odds with that very rationality of somehow assimilating the world to an infrastructure, because in that particular condition of the south coast of China and the water bodies around the South China Sea, we start seeing that change is not homogeneous. Change doesn't happen at the same time everywhere. Somehow we see things holding back. Other times we see things accelerating. We see the amazing conditions like this one, where in the upper right corner you see the city of Guangzhou, or Canton, as it was in 1990. In green, how it expanded a little bit in the 10 next years, and in blue, the explosion. But you also see the problem of cities that here only appear in gray, because somehow they don't change. When you project red and green and blue on top of each other, you get either white or different modulations of gray. But you see a lot of natural infrastructure. Somehow you start seeing the problem of demarcation appears completely in a new light. It's no longer that the cities are separate from their ground. The city becomes their ground. Somehow we start encountering a new material construction, a new condition of change and architecture, I would argue, of the very surface of the planet. And it is, of course, the very surface of the planet that we are changing. And by changing the very surface of the planet through our intervention, not only architectural, what people might call the hardware, but the very soft conditions of air, CO2, NO2, NOx, arsenic in the water, we start seeing that we are entering a new time scale, a new era, a new geological era, a new possibility of thinking not of an enlargement, of a magnification of what architecture is today to the scale of the planet, but also a rethought of what it means to intervene. If we are to analyze, we are today in a situation where that analysis can no longer be distinct from an act. We have to intervene, we have to change. So somehow you start seeing, in the terms of looking at things, in terms of visualizing them, of looking again at things, of research, the possibility of transformation. Somehow we enter a situation where the Anthropocene, the new layer that is covering or changing the surface of the planet, demands us to rethink what knowledge is, how research operates, how the step into the unknown is becoming so constrained by knowledge production systems, by forms of expertise, that we can no longer distinguish new knowledge from the instrumentalization of new knowledge, from the immediate neoliberal activation in order to of knowledge and data and sensing in order to achieve action. And this is some elements of research that I wanted to put forward to you to make you consider in the year to come in your studies what it means to think change. How do we conceive the new? How do we imagine the new away from that monster where the new constantly has to demonstrate itself as radically different and enchant us and subjugate us with its enchantment? How can we think of architecture as an operation inter alia, among the others, among other construction processes, among other form generating processes? Thank you.
First of all, I have no idea why I'm the guy to have this conversation with John. I'm completely overwhelmed by the data. Basically, my first reaction, I'm totally depressed because I don't know what to do with all this. So It's kind of a weird thing. Thank you all for having me here. It's kind of has been a couple of strange 2 or 3 months that suddenly I'm talking in the context of urban and global and region, which I'm declared publicly many, many times that I have no interest whatsoever in any of those subjects. That's maybe the reason why I'm being keep asked to come and discuss these notions. Let me see where I can start. Maybe I'm really truly impressed by your presentation, and I'm trying to figure out an angle to see if we can generate a little bit of polemic so we can entertain these people for a bit. Because honestly, my first intention seems super interesting. Let's go home and let's reflect on it. It's basically when you go to the doctor and they do an MRI and they tell everything is wrong with your body, and suddenly, okay, I have to change my diet, I have to stop smoking, and all the things that we're not going to do anyway. But there is a couple of things that I would like, a couple of notes that I was thinking when you were talking, that I think they're worth to mention. One is more on I think your fascination with the ocean is because you're Swiss, so you guys don't accustomed to sea water. That I don't think it's an important data, but I think. But talking about the MRI and the notion, one of the things I think you're touching in one maybe tangential way, which I will argue is one of the critical shifts in the last 20 years with the discipline expanding, and I think the IAC is very much part of that, is what I would say the fundamental shift from representation to simulation. So we keep talking about representation because it's a kind of a force of habit to talk of representation because it's what we know in disciplinary terms. But the truth is most of these models of information and archiving, which is almost like real-time archiving, which is a weird thing because it's collecting information and archiving as we are collecting, which also is kind of a compression of time, which is per se one of the fundamental definitions of simulation, right? So it's not really simulation in the sense of it's fake, but it's simulation of a current information happening in the real time. And I would argue that to me is one of the most revealing things of some of the issues that you're talking about. And I think to me that would be one of the points to raise in the conversation for the students. I think it's absolutely crucial for everybody to start to really change the apparatus, how we deal with the problem of representation, to be completely replaced on a paradigm of simulation and with the implications of that. Maybe that would be the first point to throw at you. And if you see what I'm saying has any relation to what you're saying, or it's just nonsense, which is probably a very possible outcome that it's nonsense, but.
It's very interesting that you proclaim at the same time to not have anything to say and then say something so sharp. I think this is a very interesting condition of rhetorics. And I think it has to do again with border technology. It has to do with trying to establish one against the other. And I'm not going in that direction. I think that you're completely right in saying that we are dealing with the end of representation. I wouldn't follow you on the notion of simulation. I think that what we are thinking here is the possibility of merging, of complete overlap. And I follow you to certain extents when you say simulation, we shouldn't understand it true or false. I have similar concerns about the very notion of truth and falsitude. But what I'm trying to point out here is really to think of these conditions as a border. So what happens when we think of architecture as a border, and at the same time we see that the border are disappearing and multiplying. They are becoming everywhere, and we are becoming the border. So this is somehow, in that sense, simulation for me is too theatrical, in the sense that it still relies so much on the possibility of distinction, of the stage, of possibility of setting up things, of making things as you go. And I like that idea because architecture is construction, you build up things, but I also think that we are entering a situation where we might have to put on hold and think for a moment that element. I'm not against simulation, but I don't follow you completely. I would like to know more.
Okay. Well, my argument has to do with the idea of I think it has to do with a long tradition of the discipline of architecture or borrowing methodologies of apparatus that they are not really defined for us specifically. I would say recently the notion of many of appropriation of animation software, of data software. One that is to produce, one is a simulation of data, I would say, which to me I find less interesting. And the other one, I'm talking about the fiction, the notion of simulation as a construction of fiction, which interests me more. Part of what I would argue that is interesting to me about what you were talking about is, and this I don't know if all the information that you presenting is absolutely truth, or is a kind of a fairly edited fabrication of a narrative. So that second version is the one I'm more interested in the simulation. I'm interested more in the simulation not as a vehicle for the production of truth. I think to me it's one of the fundamental problems an architecture has, is that always is so embedded or invested, I would say is the best word, on a moral sense of search for truth. I will advocate that the simulation more as a vehicle for the production of produce more precise false arguments. It seems to me like a much more interesting idea of simulation. That's one thing. The other thing maybe in relation to this whole notion of simulation and representation and so on, you mentioned the word of, no, it was not exactly your word, but you were talking about the revealing of knowledge. I mean, the idea that we can see knowledge produced in a massive amount. One of the things that interests me in the relation of information in any field or any kind of form of information right now is, I would argue that another interesting paradigm shift, and I'm not so sure that this is a good one, is I think in our discipline of knowledge, but in interdisciplinary knowledge, we're moving from a tradition of depth of knowledge, of deep knowledge, from one of density of knowledge, which, again, I'm not so sure that's a good thing. But I will say that I will raise my alarm as a problem of density of knowledge. It became a complete replacement of depth of knowledge. And sometimes I think part of these problems of this amount of information is they have that risk that produce density of knowledge that almost plays against the notion of deepness. And again, I'm not so sure if we should do one or the other. But in any case, I'm interested in your take on how we deal with that, or if we need to deal with that. I mean, maybe we don't need to do that, and fuck it, it is what it is. I don't know, can we do say fuck in the yak? But if not, screw it, and we just don't care about it.
I see what we're dealing with is, on one side, instrumental knowledge. And I think that is what you mean by depth. The possibility of investigating a full body of knowledge in its outlines, demarcating its contours, becoming an expert of something. And on the other side, what you call the density of data?
The density of knowledge.
Density of knowledge, I don't know really what that means. I can only think of something.
It's very simple. We used to read a newspaper, take a couple of days to read the full newspaper. Now you can go into a blog and you get all the titles very, very fast. So more density, less depth, which is most of the culture of the youth, or at least what we claim is the culture of the youth.
I think that what we are dealing with here is a possibility of not knowing where we should be in order to operate. So the question is, how do we get where we should be? How do we get to know what we ought to know in order to operate? And that is, to me, the notion of research. Rather than thinking of delineating the subject to be investigated, I think that it's much more interesting to listen to urgencies, listen to urgent thoughts or aspirations, and then try to go from there and somehow unbind or unfold the borders of that knowledge production. I'm interested in understanding how today knowledge is becoming expert knowledge and separate knowledge. And I'm really concerned about that because I see in that a reversal of political action. I see in that the possibility of undoing political bonds. I see in that the possibility basically of operating as the anti-political, where you really, as you say, go through your blog. I still think that I used to read the newspaper at breakfast, and that was it. I just folded over and it became the possibility of reorganizing a notion of what it means to be an author and a reader. No, that's the problem that I saw in the newspaper. When you have a blog that somehow summarizes everything, it's like having an index. It's okay. It's okay with me to have an index.
I'm not arguing necessarily it's a good or bad. I'm just saying it is what it is. And there's a certain level of that we accept and take as part of it. But there are a couple of points that I want to raise that they are maybe not, to be absolutely fair, they're not really directly related to what you present, but I think it has to do with what I would argue the big apparatus of technology that enhance this discussion. And one, I think it has to do with a very current discussion where I would argue that this body of research, and again, maybe it doesn't interest you, but it has to do with the notion of vision or individuality or even authorship in how we negotiate that. Because one of my simple arguments that I always tell my students is there is a whole possibility of, for sure, research, disciplinary knowledge, and technology. And I always say something very simple. If you think on somebody like Jimi Hendrix, when he played Voodoo Child, the bang, 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 that one. You need to have an electric guitar and a wah-wah pedal, and by then, 25 years of research by Gibson and Fender to produce the data and knowledge to produce that sound. And of course, you require all the technology. But at the same time, I have many friends that have electric guitars and wah-wah pedals, and they're not Jimi Hendrix. They have to be at the service and in relation with a certain notion of articulation, what we want to do with it. The reason I'm raising that is because one of the questions that always in the back of my mind when we deal with these things, with the level of information and knowledge, I would argue that the act of creativity, and in that sense I would argue for the specificity of architecture is, I don't know, I think, and this is maybe the romantic side of me, there is a certain level of unravel or not knowing that is necessary for the act of creativity. So the question is how we manage the level of information and the level of technology that we put in play for that creative act. Because in a way, creative act or an act of imagination, which is a more interesting one, and there is a certain romantic aspect of a human relationship. I mean, sometimes it's better not to know everything about the person that you're in love with or you want to be in. There is certain things about the notion of creation that require what I will call a productive ignorance to do that leap of faith that requires. So, again, it maybe is an unfair point because I don't think you were touching on that, but when you're talking about some of the things, I wonder, okay, how much is too much information, how much is too much how much is too much knowledge, and if that would not be something that paralyzes to a point.
Yeah, I understand that you might be concerned with notions of what I would call plenty. No? How can we deal with being plenty, being too much, as you say? I don't think it's too much. I think it's plenty. It's like when you go to a buffet and there's only a little sausage, or there's plenty of things. And in relation, so that is just like a footnote. But being from an island that has invested so much in its positioning itself as an attempt to operate in knowledge, in science, the Royal Society, the very birth of conjunction between capitalism and science, I somehow always at odds with the possibility of thinking that the romantic notion of the circle of creativity needs to be separate from the hardcore and hardwired data. I don't see those as being in opposition. On the contrary, I see the very functioning of the circular notion of romanticism as being the very problem that the culture that I somehow inhabit with this language is putting into the world, where you have at the same time the totality and the division. And that is what I was referring to as the monstrosity of architecture, the monstrosity of modernity. You have two things at the same time. You are completely inclusive and exclusive simultaneously. And I think that is something that really fascinates many of us, and I think that it's something that I would like to posit to the audience, how to think a practice like architecture that is at the same time making decisions, making very clear-cut distinctions in possible paths of creativity, excluding options, and at the same time being inclusive, being somehow incorporating the different parts and aspects of the world. And I think that the infrastructure or conditions that we are stuck in is limiting us. I'm not advocating for anything else than getting out of this muddle.
I would agree with you to a point about the notion of the model. First of all, I have to advocate in the defense of monsters. I like monsters. I think monsters are absolutely crucial in revealing to ourselves. So there is a kind of, I think there is a necessity for monstrosity that should not go away. I don't know, that to me was not clear if you were for or against monsters. I mean, I always think it's important to know we are against or for things. I personally am for monsters. I'm against or for life. Depends the life of who. Yeah, I'm against certain lives. But no, but I think this is to me is kind of an interesting discussion, because yes, in principle, I'm for plenty. I'm for even excess. But also there are kind of certain quantifications that have to go in relation to qualification. If I go to a restaurant, they only serve one dish, but that dish is made to perfection, one could be enough. If I go to a place and they give me 40 options, but the 40 options are 40 variations of crap, I'll take the one versus the plenty. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying, to me, it's much more what are the mechanisms that defines the quality of how we separate the information, or how we separate to integrate the transdisciplinary that some of the things that you're advocating, which I'm completely in agreement with you. The thing I will say, and again, as somebody who is a strong believer in the notion of technology, also one thing that's an interesting symptom, I'm not so sure what is going on in the YAC, but it's something that I see across the board in SCIARC and the AA and in Vienna and so on and so forth. There is a growing desire on part of the young architects and young students to start to build a certain kind of a contamination or a certain level, almost failure or imperfection into the system of information that we're producing, as a way to reclaim a certain kind of a different mechanization of creativity in relation to information. And again, it's not maybe necessary when you argue, which again, I will reinforce. In general terms, I agree with your take on it. Mine is more like, maybe I'm splitting hairs to see if we can have a discussion going somewhere, because in terms of, I think we get into the point in the evolution of this genre, which I would argue is already 25 years, in which we need to start to be that precise. And I think that level of precision, maybe the discussion can start to happen. Maybe, I don't know, you want to respond on this, and maybe we should then open for questions so the people can go to cocktail and dinners and go on with their lives.
Talking here with Manuel, trying to figure out whether you are using the word of master as in a positive or in a negative way, because you started saying, you're starting using the word of master in order mainly to define the way architecture has been extended in the territory and in the regions. And then it rather seems that you change it in a more negative way, while all this is related with the borders that we were talking about, but mainly with the borders in a negative way, although they are not spatial borders, as we are saying, no? And I don't know, maybe that's a question to start with, but other people would also maybe contribute.
Do you make a round? No, whether I'm pro or against monsters. No, it's not about that. It's not about. It's trying to figure out how we deal with the world. So, how do you figure out? How do you distinguish? How do you make things appear? And I would argue that the appearing of things is monstrosity. It's how monsters operate. It is above and beneath the visual. It's above and beneath the conscious. It's not just, it's a horror movie. No, it's not that. It's really thinking that the monster is somehow a condition through which architecture presents itself to the world and asserts its presence. Architecture almost never appears just like that. It appears and asserts itself. There's a level of assertion which is very interesting, and I'm obviously fascinated by that. I'm an architect, I really want to do that. I'm just, in an analytical sense, I'm trying to link this assertion, this frontality of architecture to the current multiplication of border technologies in order to make us think what it means to think of assertion, assertive actions. How do you make things new appear? And I would argue that that today means to rethink the practice, to rethink our means of production as a monstrous condition, where you constantly need to switch over, to cross the boundary.
Just if you permit to complete this, perhaps the paradox is because it was very interesting, to be sincere, and thank you. You talk about monsters, borders, negotiation, and probably the idea is that I don't know, our generation or our thinking, our knowledge, it's more, accepts more the impurity. I think this is a big conquest of our moment, the capacity to accept the impurity. The impurity is not impurity in the sense of moral. Impurity is that we are exchanging informations, we are crossing informations, and the exchange is impure because the exchange is not. This is a curious thing because the impurity is very linked with the idea of monster. The monster is an impurity. And always it was very interesting in this idea that the architecture that we are trying to do and the negotiation is also an impurity, is working not in a, how to explain, purist, typological, taxonomical divisions in categories, in rationalist, deterministic, and formal, but we work with strategical combinations, and sometimes these combinations are impure and are monsters. Monsters in the sense of, is to them, a city which is growing is monstrous. It's a city that we have a lot of conflictive things that are monstrous, in the sense negative. But in more conceptual sense, more positive, we can we can think that this word monster is simply linked with this capacity to work with atypological situations, negotiate situations, strategical situations. And for this reason I was interested, and probably there the paradox that if monster was good or not. Evidently it's a word and the words are codes of signification. But I was very interested in this idea. You are interested in this relation between polity and space, architecture there. Polity is the capacity of the society to organize organization of their, how to explain, their expectatives and also their potentials. And architecture is the same, is the capacity of the societies to organize not administration or structures, but habitat structures, but at the same is this idea that the architecture is a mediator, a negotiator between space and society, at the end, and politics. There we need a negotiation, and we are in a very clear situation that we accept the complexity as an impure reality. We can disciplinate the complexity, or we can express the complexity. There is the division between some guys of architecture that are determinist on lineal and some other kind of explorations of research that are more linked with this capacity to work with information, etc. But in this case, perhaps the monster is a good word, but I don't know. This was just to the best, the beast. The beast is the best, and the beauty is the monster.
In literature, the beast comes unannounced. Like Derrida's text on the wolf. It appears when you haven't heard it yet. Suddenly it makes itself visible in its condition. And what is interesting, of course, in the notion of the beast is like the notion of the sovereign, it's outside of the law. It's outside the conditions that document and regulate cohabitation. It operates through exception, through the notion of stepping out and the limit. And in that sense, I think the monster is architecture. It is exactly that condition of the technology of the border. And I would really like to see some of the work in a few months think what it means to separate, what it means to put into the world things that enable, because that is always the enabling function of infrastructure, and suddenly see that that is somehow engulfed in that system of separation. So somehow, not in a negative mood, don't get me wrong, on the contrary. I'm really trying to mark the terrain upon which many of us need to float, which is an impure terrain, which is concocted by, not by us, it's inherited. It's full of things that we wouldn't like, full of things that we cannot take into consideration. And my point is that we should not consider the unwanted, the impure, as the byproduct of modernization, something that needs to be assimilated. On the contrary, I'm thinking that we need to take that seriously as part of this unfinished and unfinishable project of modernity.
I wanted to recap on the sense of the space and a reflection of what you did, not only from the physical point of view, but also talking about the borders as separators of regions. And the example of the United Nations is very clear when it's not physical. And it was created with a very specific moment in history to satisfy in that moment a need. Let's say it was like the context made it appear. And now it's becoming obsolete, we can say. I think that the last crisis in Iraq says that the United Nations maybe is getting obsolete. In the same sense, don't you think that most of the structures that we take for granted today are also getting obsolete and also recovering some thoughts from Bauman and his, I don't know if you have known Sigmund Bauman and all his thesis about how everything is becoming liquid and how everything is flowing along everything, no? And this impureness is actually coming from this mixture of the things that they are no longer staying or they are no longer solid as we took them for taking again back the history. So what would be the role in this scenario in which maybe the architecture is not, the space also becomes obsolete and all remains to our bodies or I don't know. So which is the purpose now of architecture while all the things that seems, where they are not anchorage to put it on it. So
I was having a discussion earlier at the symposium of the World Bank that is now going on in Barcelona. There was a discussion about what do you do when you are running out of money, when you no longer have money. And Jaime Lerner was saying, it's fantastic, take off another zero from the budget. No? And suddenly you will start seeing possibilities and potentials that you didn't think of. And somehow I think that that is what you're trying to describe. There's a possibility, there's a potential in this condition of the infrastructural unconscious. And that is to think architecture as a construction. We can build new institutions, we can build new polities, we can build new spaces. And we can build new spaces not just out of scratch, not starting from an empty slate, but we can start thinking of architecture maybe as an augmentation. We can augment things. We can work together with other things. We can rethink how we achieve the vision of labor. We can think how we take on work of other peoples. We can start rethinking the very notion of authority and who's the author of what. And in that sense, then I think that the notion of the model can become the obsolete thing. And I'm particularly interested in thinking how form gets into being through not, let's say, a positive way, that you posit form, but through a concomitance of processes. In that sense, I really appreciate that Hernan is here, because I share an interest in form-generating processes, in self-governing systems, and how to see collapse and as a form-generating process.
Okay, so I don't know, there's a couple of things. One is always the urgency of the current time seems what is upon us more than anything else. Now, if you read any historical book of architecture, architecture has been in crisis since the Renaissance. For some reason, we tend to believe that at some moment that those architects got it better than us. It's always we've been in a crap position. I mean, it always amazes me every year at the beginning of SCI-Arc that so many innocent souls come with a hope and how this profession is going to crash then later on. We know that. What I would try to offer, which I agree with John takes on it, of the possibilities, but I will say 2 or 3 things that probably is not going to give you a solution to what you're asking, but to me is a kind of a more precise diagnostic I can make, at least in the reality that I operate more often than not, which is the American, which is, I would argue, is slightly different with the European one, and is one of the fundamental problems that we have in architecture right now is that more than ever, the discipline and the profession are not talking to each other. And the reason why we always are so nostalgic about modernism is because modernism is one of the few times in history that it seems that the discipline and the profession were in the same sync. I would argue that one of our main problems is that architecture has been hijacked by the notion of industrial service. And I think one of the things I like a lot about the technological apparatus that is available for us is that we don't need to rely on those failed capitalist model of architecture as a service industry. I think architecture needs to climb again and again and again the cultural materiality, disciplinary knowledge than it has. And I think there are as many takes as people are in this room, and I mean, there's no way to define that. But I think what we can do is start to stop thinking of the idea that architecture solves a problem that was, of a question that was posed by somebody else, and start to speculate how each of us can start to define that. And the other thing which I will say, and this is more like a conceptual and abstract one, but I like how it sounds a lot, so I'm going to use it again, is I think architects, we need to get out of the business of people, and we need to start to get in the business of audiences, which is something that many other creative disciplines are doing way better than us. And I think we are still trapped in this kind of demagogical, political understanding of architecture that I think is obsolete. And I think we need to change that perception. There is a thing I participated 3 weeks ago, a discussion with a group of people in Los Angeles called 5D, which are this bunch of lunatics that they made a lot of money in the movie industry, and they get fed up, and they have this kind of a creative think tank. So basically, they brought a bunch of people to discuss ideas about future cities, this mambo-jumbo that everybody seems to be, from the World Bank to Hollywood, they all seems to care about the future of the cities. Not me. For me, cities are fine, leave it alone. They can do whatever they want. But there was one guy that posed, which I think is a fundamental question, and I think John talk goes to the heart of that. The guy was a video game designer, but he was the son of two architects. And for obvious reason, he didn't want to be an architect. But he says that one of the things he couldn't understand about architects is we don't have a word that replaces user. A video game has an user. A car designer has a driver. Architects, we have a client who pays for the building or pays for the urban or whatever, but they're not necessarily people who are going to use it. And I think that part is very simple, and I think, wow, this 22-year-old kid fucked up 25 years of my life. Because I realized, okay, this guy is clever and is understanding. I think this is the problem of the notion of audience. And how we understand architecture as a creative force, of a creative imagination, they had to play a different role than the one that has been played. I would argue that in many regards, architecture is still based on the Renaissance models when we were buffoons of the court. It hasn't changed much. And the only way that we can change, and I think all these new emerging possibilities are an opportunity, is for us to rethink what else architecture can do that is just not building. I mean, every time that somebody says architecture is matter management, not necessarily it's only building. There's many other things that we can start to operate. That was a very long answer to a question I should say, I don't know. But this is kind of my elaborate question to say, I don't know. I'm just saying there's no reason to be pessimistic. I think we have all the reason to be more optimistic than ever. Because when there is this major crisis is when interesting things happen because nobody's watching or nobody knows what to do. Is the moment that people seem to trust more in architects when nobody knows what to do. When everybody seems to know what to do is when we are more screwed. So I think it's a fascinating time, but I think it's just another crisis in the thousand crises that architecture goes through every 6 months, not even a decade. So again, that was kind of a very long answer. I don't know.
So let's have drinks.
Yes.